James Carter stepped into a small roadside diner. His old dark brown coat hung loosely over his shoulders, buttons fastened to ward off the cold outside. The diner was quiet, with only a few customers silently sipping their coffee. A waitress leaned against the counter, engrossed in a newspaper. James nodded to her before choosing a small table by the window, placing both hands on the table and glancing at his watch. His son, Daniel, was running late, but he wasn't in a hurry. He had always been patient. He could feel the glances, just quick looks, but enough to remind him of where he was. A diner primarily for white patrons, in a neighborhood he rarely visited. But he didn't mind. It was just another day. Just a cup of coffee in a strange town. He signaled to the waitress, who approached with a neutral expression. "A cup of coffee, please." "Thank you," James said with a slight smile. She nodded and poured coffee into a cup without saying a word. James wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling its warmth as he observed the surroundings. The doorbell chimed, and instinctively, he glanced over his shoulder. A police officer walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, with a perpetually stern face. His eyes scanned the diner before stopping at James. He didn't look away. The officer approached. "Are you lost?" His voice carried suspicion. "Just waiting for my son," James replied calmly. He had heard that tone too many times before. The officer frowned. "Your son?" He sneered, glancing around the diner. "Don't see many people like you around here. How long do you plan on staying?" James lifted the cup to his lips, took a slow sip, then answered, "As long as I want, officer." The officer let out a mocking laugh, his lips curling into a contemptuous smirk. "This place isn't for drifters. People here aren't comfortable seeing you." James met his gaze. "I'm not bothering anyone, just having coffee." The officer leaned in closer, his voice lower but filled with menace. "Let me see your ID, old man." James silently took out his wallet, retrieved his veteran's card, and handed it over without a word. The officer took it, gave it a cursory glance, then tossed it back onto the table with a scornful chuckle. "A veteran, huh? Not sure I buy that," he scoffed. "You think this piece of paper gives you the right to be here?" James remained composed. "Believe what you want. I know who I am." The officer laughed loudly, drawing a few glances from the other patrons. "Yeah, I know your type. Pretending to be respectable, acting like you're somebody." James's patience wavered for a brief moment, but he kept his voice steady. "Do you have a problem with me, officer?" The officer leaned in even closer, his voice turning into a harsh whisper. "My problem is people like you thinking you can go anywhere, thinking you deserve respect. You don't belong here, and I don't like people like you testing their luck." James tightened his grip on the coffee cup but remained composed. "I'm just a man having coffee," he replied quietly, not looking for trouble. "But trouble seems to find you, doesn't it?" The officer sneered. "Maybe it's time you left before I make this official." James took a deep breath, his fingers lightly pressing against the rim of his cup. He could feel the tension in the officer's gaze and the oppressive atmosphere in the diner. He glanced at his watch, wondering how much longer his son would take. "Maybe I'll just sit here and wait," James finally said, his voice still calm. The officer's face darkened. "Suit yourself, old man, but be smart and don't make me keep an eye on you." James gripped the edge of the table as the officer's shadow loomed over his coffee cup. The officer lingered for a moment, his cold gaze trying to decipher what James would do next. But James remained silent, taking another sip of coffee, pretending not to care. A faint smile crossed his lips, not out of joy, but because he knew how these confrontations always played out. After a few tense seconds, The officer scoffed and turned toward the counter. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but never took his eyes off James. The hostility in his stare was palpable, something James was all too familiar with. The doorbell chimed again. James glanced over his shoulder, and this time he sighed in relief. Daniel walked in, tall, wearing a dark coat, his hair slightly tousled by the cold wind outside. His eyes quickly scanned the diner and settled on his father. Daniel smiled, but the smile faded when he sensed the tension in the room. He glanced at the officer near the counter, then back at his father. No words were needed. James knew his son had already pieced together what was happening. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from James, removing his gloves and placing them on the table. "Sorry I'm late, Dad." "Traffic." His voice was gentle, but there was something cautious in his gaze. James simply nodded, then looked at the officer once more. He was still watching, but said nothing. It seemed Daniel's presence made him hesitate. Daniel ordered a cup of coffee for himself, then turned to his father. "You okay?" James smiled, lifting his cup. "I'm fine." But they both knew that in a world where wary eyes constantly followed them, that fine was only temporary.